Forward-facing sonar has changed bass fishing forever, but most guys still don't realize how deep it goes. Whether you use LiveScope or not, it's changing how bass act, where they live, and maybe even their DNA. One new study gives us insights into what may be coming your way. So this isn't a LiveScope debate, but there's one thing that's clear and you can't debate. LiveScope is changing fishing very quickly. And just how quickly and how dramatically? Well, one new study in 2025 shows exactly how quickly bass populations evolve. They change, their DNA changes, their conditioning changes. So let's dive into that, and then we'll talk about what this means for your lake, how the fish are changing and evolving, and how you get ahead of it. Now, this isn't a doom and gloom video. This isn't the end of our fisheries. It's changing. If you LiveScope, you've seen it already. That's gotten harder. Fish are more aware of it. If you like to fish shallow or not use it, there are a number of opportunities where fishing could get significantly better for you. But the big thing in fishing, how do guys win tournaments? How do they do well consistently? There's one prevailing strategy that's always worked, and that's getting ahead of the curve. You can do one of two ways. One is seasonally. So if it's a springtime tournament, the news is spread, fish are on beds or everywhere. If you do that, yeah, a lot of fish are doing it, but guess what? Everybody in the tournament, everybody out there that weekend, they're all doing it. You're fighting for the same fish. The guys who get on the next season, so post-spawn or shad spawn, find the first deep fish, are the ones out chasing shad. Guess what? Nobody else is doing it. They have it to themselves. They're ahead of the curve. That's who usually has a banner day or who wins tournaments. And then let's look at LiveScope. Was it the technology that really did it, or it's the fact that they were the first people out there doing it at first? When they first went out, nobody else was fishing for those fish. They got ahead of the curve. Now that everybody's out there, the competition is fierce. And yeah, some guys are catching them big out there, but it's the best of the best. So again, getting ahead of the curve is the key. And now that LiveScope is here, it's changing how fish act. So getting ahead of the curve again and figuring out now with all this pressure on these fish out in the middle, they're seeing all these minnows. Guess what? They're doing different things. So getting ahead of that and doing the next step, that's how you consistently catch them. So let's dive into it. So what really got me thinking about this was there were 3 studies recently published in 2025, spearheaded by Cornell University, and they looked at a small lake in the Adirondacks in upstate New York called Little Moose Lake. And they had smallmouth in there that at the turn of the century, about 1900, smallmouth were introduced. They were non-native species. They were basically out competing a lot of the native species like the trout, and they wanted to get rid of them. They wanted to eradicate them. So starting in the year 2000, they started electrofishing the lake 4 times a year, and every single smallmouth that they shocked up, they would measure it and then euthanize it, get it out of the lake. And then any native species, they would measure those as well, return them to lake. They did that 4 times a year, and this went on for over 20 years. Now, the researchers estimated they were eliminating about 25% of the smallmouth population every single year when they shocked it. And what they predicted was they were going to crash the population and basically eradicate smallmouth. The smallmouth, they had different ideas. So basically, within just a few years, the smallmouth evolved and they started growing faster in a single year and also maturing earlier. So what they were able to do was reach reproduction age at a quicker pace, and then the population actually changed. So the amount of fish over 12 inches crashed, almost none of those. But the population of the small fish, like 5 inches, actually exploded. There were more smallmouth in the lake after a few years than when they started. The bass literally evolved. They became mature at a younger age more rapidly, and they grew quicker to get to that maturity to counter the removal. Now, the smallmouth changed their behavior too. Obviously, the ones that weren't skittish, that weren't afraid of a boat, those were the ones that let the boat come over their head, got shocked up and removed. The ones that were real skittish and averse, well, those were the ones that remained and passed down their genes. And guess what? Basically, they unnaturally selected for those wary ones. So the population changed. They noticed the difference in the smallmouth there, whereas the other native species, they were returned back, no change to them. So the bass not only changed their size and their growth rate, but they also changed how wary they were as a population. Now, they were also observing the population, the numbers, and the size of all these other species, and a number of them, when the smallmouth crashed, their population went up, but a lot of those, after about 5-10 years, the population came back, and some populations actually changed their growth rates, and some actually decreased in population and size. So basically, when they change one dynamic in this population, it's a very complicated food web. Some species benefited, some didn't do as well, some did well at first and then didn't do as well long term. Basically, it changed the entire dynamic of the entire lake. So this is one lake, and it's a fairly small one, and pretty dramatic changes to it when they were coming in and radically removing a lot of the fish. But it kind of gives you a little insight of how quickly bass can adapt and how radically. I mean, it's, their size changes, their DNA changes. That's a lot going on. When we think about LiveScope, not quite as radical, but it could, on a single lake or a lot of lakes, it could have some major implications. So with that in mind of how much bass could change, let's kind of dive into what could be happening on all lakes, single lakes, based on the pressure from LiveScope. So let's start off with a couple basics here. Fishing pressure, we talk about it, and there's more pressure offshore now, but the fishing pressure in general, obviously it spiked during COVID, and then LiveScope kind of took off right after that. But the number of people fishing is pretty much the same. So the lakes aren't getting more pressure, it's where the pressure is allocated. It used to be everybody was beating the bank. If you got offshore, you got away from it. In the last couple of years, it seems like everybody's offshore. The bank, there's less pressure. And the other question, we don't really have a good answer to this one. All those fish that were out in the middle, sometimes we speculated bass lived out there. We kind of knew that maybe there's an untapped population, but we had no idea how many were out there. We still don't totally know how many fish live offshore versus on the bank. And to me, the big question, the unanswered one, those fish that were out in the middle, were they out there because all the fishing pressure on the bank, we were just 24/7, 365, the bank was just getting beat up. So were a lot of these fish escaping pressure and living out in the open? Or do those fish just live out there because that's where the prey is? Most of the time we're out there, we've been living here the whole time. You guys didn't know it. So, they've always been out there. We've always missed that. That's the big question. And depending if they did that, it's hard for us to really know which way this is going to go because we don't know if they were always out there or these fish, we forced them out there. So since we don't really know if we forced them out there, if they're always out there, let's look at a couple different scenarios of how this could impact it. Now, one could be that they've always been out there and these fish, they didn't get pressured at all. And then all of a sudden they come to the bank in the spring for about 2-3 months. We get this bonus, we get the good fishing, and then they went back out there. And unless they were on the bottom, we couldn't find them. But the suspended ones, you couldn't get those. The ones on the bottom, we could deep crank them and Carolina rig, all that stuff, but they weren't getting that much pressure. So these fish, and I've heard this speculated, that, they weren't getting pressure for about 9 months of the year, maybe 10 months of the year, hadn't seen a lure, come in green to the bank, time to spawn, pre-spawn, spawn, shad spawn, run back out there deep. If that's the case, those fish that hadn't seen a lure for 10 months and were kind of green when they came up there, that might explain why spring fishing sometimes is so good. We all do so well in the spring, and they just haven't seen a lure for 10 months. But now if they're seeing a lure 24/7, out deep out there, then when they come to the bank, well, they're not as green. They're used to seeing lures. They're already more skittish. That could really mean for us shallow water fishermen, the ones that love that, it's just going to be tougher in the shallows because those fish are being harassed when they're out deep and they're already wary when they're coming in shallow. Now, I think the flip side of this could be that those fish were out there because of fishing pressure. Everybody for years and years was beating up the bank, going in a row down the banks and just pounding those fish, and they went out to the middle to get away from the fishing pressure. And that kind of always made the bank bite a little bit tougher. Well, in this case, where more and more and more pressure is going out deep, and it's very targeted pressure. Those fish don't just sit out there. They're being thrown at on a constant basis. Well, all of a sudden, if those fish were out in the middle to avoid pressure, they're darn sure going to be moving away from the deep pretty quickly here because they're wide open and no place to hide out there. They could actually be coming back to the shallows to avoid the pressure because guess what? There's way less fishing pressure in the shallows now. So in that scenario, the shallow bite, the number of fish up shallow, may be more than it ever was in our lifetimes because all that pressure was up on the bank. Well, now it's going to be driving them back to the bank. Now you can already see that I don't necessarily have the answers for this. I'm asking the questions, but I think you need to get your mind wrapping around what is this doing to the fish? What are the possibilities? Because like I said, being ahead of the curve, everybody's out there pinging a minnow now and stuff. you can go join that crowd, or you can figure out where they're going next. If you're one of the first people to figure out where they're going next in your lake, you're going to do really well. So there's a lot of questions to be asked, and it's going to vary from a shallow muddy reservoir to a real deep clear one, from one lake to the next, an urban one versus a really remote one that's out in the country not getting much fishing pressure. Every lake's going to be different, but this kind of gives you some insight into what you're going to be looking for. So let's dive into a few more things, both with conditioning plus maybe evolution. Where could this be going a little bit more specifically? All right, so let's dive into the list of adaptations from LiveScope, what could be changing. You know, some people are worried about the beam. They're talking about the LiveScope, that the fish feel it, move away. That's possible. I mean, it's you know, maybe there's things we don't understand. The frequency of it is like 800,000 to like 1.2 million hertz, which the top end of the bass hearing range is about 1,000 hertz. So it's ultrasonic, so they shouldn't be hearing the beam. You know, maybe there's a way they can sense it or something, so you can't totally rule that out, but basically the fisheries biologists tell you that's probably not happening. What could be happening, though, these fish before were swimming around in the open, nobody was throwing lures at them, just maybe by accident, but you were driving over the fish, casting at the bank. Now you're getting really targeted with them. What they could condition to pretty quickly, obviously, is the wave slaps against the hull, that hull slap, pretty easily heard sound. And then also just the mechanical noises of the boat when you have the trolling motor. Definitely conditioning to boats. They could be more sensitive about that going forward for sure. Now, some of the classic lure conditioning, you already see that happening, where splatting down on the surface, even if a fish, you throw it and he's 10, 15, 20 feet down below, that big plop on the surface, dropping it right on their head. When LiveScope first came out, guys were catching them, you could just drop it right on them. Active fish, you can still do it. A lot of them are skittish, and that plop, that's turning fish away. And then with the type of baits and stuff, what works, you know, jerk baits were king at the beginning, they still work. Now it's the jig head minnow. You're seeing that evolve quickly, and the fuzzy dice, all this different stuff. The way lures are presented, and all of a sudden, when a few years ago, like the Kitex came out, the boot tails, you could just reel those out in the open and fish would come running for them. That doesn't seem to be near as appealing now. Guys are having to use jig head minnows and Nico rigs and really carefully target these fish. How they react to baits and stuff, obviously that's one of the first things that happen. The splashes on the surface and the bait motion, a lot of that's conditioning is already happening. We've already seen that. So those are pretty obvious ones. The next step, though, remember going back to my question, are the fish out there because they were fishing pressure that pushed them out there and they wanted to get away from pressure? Or was it because that's where the food's at? Now, if this is their best feeding opportunity, they may continue to act the same out there just because, well, the way the shad are setting up and the herring, all that stuff, they're going to still hunt them the same way that they always did. Now, if they're out there because of fishing pressure on the bank kind of sent them out there, it may be they decide that, well, I'm feeding this way high in the water column now because if I'm on the bank, I get targeted. If I go deep on these points, crankbaits and Carolina rigs get me. But when I'm up here and high in the water column, nobody's targeting me up until recently. If that's the case, all of a sudden they may start reacting differently, where they get farther away from the shore out in the dead center of the lake. Because when you look at shad so much of the time in the winter time, in the summertime, man, you can find them from the backs of creeks to the middles of creeks to the center of the lake. They're kind of all over the place. Yeah, they bunch up at times, but a lot of times they're all over. And then there are other times where, you know, it's just the catfish and white bass, everything kind of gets in certain areas. So the bass kind of follow the main forage, but a lot of times they have a lot of different options. If they have more options, those ones that we're seeing now, they're high in the water column chasing and stuff, they may set up differently. Instead of being, like I said, just out on points and stuff that are more structure, it may move them to places where there's no structure. It may move them, instead of into the open water, they may become more cover oriented again, where they bury up more in cover, get in obscure cover, the stuff that's thicker or thinner, stuff that we don't target. These fish could actually change their actual feeding behavior to go to the areas that are getting less pressure, and what's going to basically, wherever they see less lures, that's where I'm going to set up camp, because I'm trying to get away from, I can feed anywhere I want. I'm going where there's less pressure, not necessarily where the food is, because I can find food just about anywhere. Now, another thing they could do is they could continue to move a lot more. Obviously, if they stick around in one place, those are the ones that if you just always show up in that same, if they show up in the same spot, they get fished for day after day. if they're really on the move and roam a lot, kind of like what stripers and smallmouth do, here today, gone tomorrow, always on the move, they're not going to get targeted as much. So maybe they move way more than they used to. The other extreme could be anytime I get a really thick cover, I don't really get fished for that much, especially like grass, thick grass. If I bury up in there, the boats aren't coming over me. I'm not getting fished for with minnows and stuff. Maybe they start burying up in really thick cover. They get in the thickest brush piles, and if they get in the inside of it, they can feed inside there. But again, they're not seeing the baits, whizzing by them all the time. So they could either be movers all the time, could force them into the really, really, really thick cover where they just can't get seen on LiveScope. And another thing with prey, bass, the reason they're so good, so adaptable, live in pretty much every continent except for Antarctica on the planet, can live in just about any lake, is because they can eat about anything. So right now, these ones that are living offshore, they're on the herring and shad mostly, a little bit of minnows and stuff, but they're more those pelagic, those bait fish feeders. A lot of these fish could shift. They'll eat bluegill, they'll eat crawdads, anything they can get in their mouth, basically. It could change what they eat. And the unintended consequence of that, like we saw in the smallmouth study, all of a sudden that could maybe crash the bluegill population, change that population, change the population of the crawdads. When they start eating that stuff, maybe the bass start to get fatter or longer. They live longer. It's more fat dense or calorie dense, something like that. It could actually change the makeup of bass as they start eating more bluegill, more shad, more crawdads. It could change the fishery, and that, like I said, that's going to vary from one fishery to another. But in some extreme cases where everybody was live scoping, it got them off shad and more onto crawdads and bluegill. I could see where on those lakes, the fish get fatter and shorter, or fatter and longer, live shorter, could change the population. And then the one other thing you noticed on LiveScope, the fish that are suspended, man, those are like just sitting ducks. The ones that live around tight cover, they're a little bit harder to see, but they're kind of predictable locations. You can draw them out. The ones that hug to the bottom, they're the hardest to see. And that's always been the case. If you ever fish for smallmouth, it's amazing. You can be fishing on the bottom, and if you're dragging a tube or something, you can be right over top of them. And all of a sudden you catch one fish, and it's like a swarm of bees just come up, and they just they're ghosts. They just come up out of the bottom, and your whole graph will light up with fish just coming up chasing the one that you hooked. Fish, we could be forcing them to all of a sudden be more bottom dwellers, to sit really tight to the bottom where they don't show up on our graphs. And I've seen that, we used to, the structure fishing used to be nobody did it. Then we got down image and side and all that. And it used to be when we first did it, fish offshore, like in the 90s, 2000s, and it got really popular with down scan, all that. Well, at that point, it went from you could graph the schools all the time to all of a sudden you couldn't graph them so well. They started hugging the bottom more, it seemed like. And they just knew that if a boat came, it's time to hunker down. Well, I could see that with LiveScope. A lot of these fish, instead of being up high, they hear a boat. The ones that figure out that if I go to the bottom, I don't get caught. Well, all the fish might start acting that way, where all of a sudden you start scanning your beam around, they can hear the boat, see the shadow of your boat, the hull slap or whatever. I could see a lot more fish starting to hug the bottom where they look like there's nothing there, but guess what? They're all just tucked down. As soon as you get past, hey, we know he's gone, pop back up. Now, a couple other things to factor in, the aggressiveness, that's always the one that you worry about. The most aggressive ones, the ones get caught, those are the most likely ones to get taken in and either be cleaned or die in delayed mortality or something. So the aggressive ones, we could be removing enough of those from the population. If this makes us much more effective as fishermen, yeah, we could affect the population by, that could be a downside. We could be removing a lot of the biggest, most aggressive ones. The flip side is the fish that are in groups are more aggressive. The solo ones, they're more timid or they're just more wary. When there's multiple, it's like two kids or two dogs, you put a toy in front of them, then they compete over it. Whether by themselves, like, whatever, I can get it anytime I want. Those single fish, right now on scope, they're harder to target, and they may figure out or may just change to, instead of feeding in groups, the ones that are more solo, they don't get caught as often. And fish, instead of feeding in schools, they may be rewarded for being more individuals. They don't get caught. And maybe we divide or change the fish populations from going to grouping behavior of feeding to rewarding those that are more singles. So we may see more solos. And then one other big shift, this happens some now on our lakes, but some fish feed at night, and I think all of them feed a bit at night. But there's some populations they've tracked that, these big fish like in Texas on Lake Fork, those ones that really basically only got active around sunset, fed during the night, and then were pretty inactive during the day. If all of a sudden these fish are the same ones that go to the bank and live out in the middle, and they're getting fished for 24/7, 365, like I talked about, they're always seeing lures. Wintertime, I'm seeing lures out here. Summertime, I'm roaming, I'm seeing them when I come to the bank in the spring and the fall. I'm seeing lures, guys throwing at me. Dude, I'm over it. I'm not feeding during the day anymore. We could be forcing a lot of fish to become nocturnal. It's, obviously they can feed day or night. We may be driving a lot of populations to be night feeders because all of a sudden they don't see lures then. Might be the time to take up night fishing. As I say, the only constant is change. Things are always changing, and we kind of get set in our ways where we like to catch them a particular way. That's not how life goes, though. The bass change, and this is not all doom and gloom. A couple things have been shown. You need to keep these in mind. The biggest factor affecting your lake and how good of a spawn, your population, its habitat. It's been proven lakes that have shallow grass, that habitat for young of the year, you don't need a big adult population. What you need is habitat for young fish. So you can put in thick brush piles and stuff they can live in. You can have high water levels in lakes. The high water gives more habitat. Or if there's grass in the lake, when there's a lot of habitat, that's what truly impacts how many fish are in there, because those young of the year can survive until adulthood. They're not laid bare where they're eaten by everything else. And then the other thing that's been proven, catch and release works. It's dramatically impacted our fisheries. It had those fish, if you turn them back, yes, some get gut hooked, there's some delayed mortality, but guess what? In general, catch and release works. Most people throw them back, and as long as we're doing that, the fish may get more wary, they may be tougher to catch, but where did the world record tying fish come from recently? It came from Japan. That Lake Biwa over there, those lakes get more pressure than anywhere in the world. Those fish, my understanding is a lot of them, it's illegal to release bass. You're supposed to take them out. They're an invasive species. And guess what? Under all that pressure, just like the smallmouth and the Adirondacks, they evolve, they change, and they find a way to make it. So catch and release works. And the other thing that's going for us, tournaments now, the BPT's done it. A number of other organizations are doing it. Kayakers do it. And there's the adoption of the catch, weigh, release, where you weigh those fish instantly in the boat. That's starting to take hold. A lot of the mortality of fish are ones that we take great care of, but during the summertime, it's been proven a lot of those tournaments, the delayed mortality, we're killing a lot of those biggest fish. The fact that a lot of those fish, if tournaments change more and more, go to that catch, weigh, and instant release, that could have a way bigger impact on bass populations and big fish than what the forward-facing sonar is doing. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are actually, if we get decent habitat, we take better care of our own fish, fishing actually could get better. And I think on a lot of our lakes, you catch more and bigger fish than we ever have. So for your lake, how's it going to change? How is LiveScope going to impact it? All I can tell you for sure is it is going to be impacted, and somebody is going to be ahead of the curve and figure it out. Now, if you're trying to escape the fishing pressure right now, trying to make better mental decisions on the water and release more fish unharmed, check out these videos or check out my full science playlist to break it down, the science to catch more bass. Hey, quick side note, you like the sun hoodie? This is my new favorite. $15.99, got it on Amazon. I'll put a link down in the description, plus some other favorites on Amazon. Cheap, good stuff.